Welcome and thank you for joining us today. This is Global Meets Local, New Transnational Organized Crime Trends in Africa. Your moderator today is Ornella Moderan, ENACT Advisory Board Member. For our online audience, please keep your microphones and cameras turned off during the event. Should you have any questions, kindly use the chat function on your Zoom application. The questions and comments will be sent to the moderator. To access the chat function, kindly scroll to the bottom of your Zoom application, click on the chat button and the chat box will appear. Should you wish to raise your hand, kindly click on the reactions button to access the raise hand function. We also have language interpretation available today. Please select the language of your preference by clicking on the interpretation button on your Zoom application. We will evaluate this event for our online audience using an online poll. The evaluation is completely anonymous and it helps us to present better events in future. Kindly do take a moment to complete it. It'll be launched following the presentations portion for today's event. Please note that since this is a public event being broadcast live on YouTube, Chatham House rule does not apply. You may be quoted without your express permission. As we wait for the final participants to connect their audio, we kindly remind you to please keep your microphones muted and your cameras turned off until we reach the Q&A portion for today. This is Global Meets Local, New Transnational Organized Crime Trends in Africa. Ornella, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone, and welcome, distinguished guests, both in person and joining us online for this event today. My name is Ornella Moderan. I was just introduced. I am a member of the advisory board of the ENACT program. ENACT stands for Enhancing Africa's Response to Transnational Organized Crime. It is a joint program by the Institute of Security Studies, the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, and the Global Police Organization, Interpol, funded by the European Union. Today, we come together to discuss a critical issue, the changing landscape of organized crime. This is at a time of multiple security and political challenges and shifts on the continent and in the world. Taking stock of a complex and rapidly changing regional and global environment, this event aims to unveil new trends, challenges, and potential solutions for combating organized criminal activities on the continent. We are lucky to have a diverse group of experts and professionals here and online today to share insights. And the hybrid format, I hope, will enable a global conversation essential to addressing these issues. So without further ado, let me turn to Matthew Wilner-Reid, who is the coordinator of the EU's Global Illicit Flows Program, for his opening remarks on behalf of the European Union. Matthew?
Thank you very much, Ornella, and good morning, everyone, both here in the room and online. It is a pleasure to be providing some opening remarks for this webinar this morning, and to be here in Interpol in beautiful Lyon with some extremely knowledgeable people on the panel who are going to provide some very interesting insights later today. So I am the coordinator of the Global Illicit Flows Programme in the European Commission's Service for Foreign Policy Instruments. The Global Illicit Flows Programme is a collection of currently 12 global and trans-regional projects seeking to build capacity to counter organised crime notably across Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa, West and East, and now also Central Asia, Middle East, and basically the whole world. And that is about a year, a full partner and part of the Global Illicit Flows Programme, and notably it is the part that provides the evidence base, or part of the evidence base on which we base our interventions, and which provide invaluable insights to us in the European Union and to policymakers around the world. The view from the European Union in terms of organized crime is that we're seeing rising illicit flows of all kinds and rising violence connected to those flows. And that is obviously pushing organized crime up the agenda within Europe. However, organized crime by its very nature is transnational, transregional. So developments in Europe do impact Africa and vice versa. So we're all very much connected in this field. The European Commission will be bringing out a communication very shortly, outlining our priorities for the coming couple of years in the field of organized crime, in particular drugs trafficking. And you'll see in that communication a focus particularly on the Gulf of Guinea and drug trafficking through that area, which also touches on the Sahel and up into Europe. But beyond that, I think the context is a cause for concern in many areas. The coups we've seen in the Sahel, continued insecurity in the Horn of Africa and elsewhere, is creating instability, which organized crime thrives off of. Particularly, particularly in the context of yesterday's attack in Brussels, we're also seeing a heightened risk of terrorism. Not that yesterday's attack was necessarily linked to organized crime, but in other parts of the world, there is a very clear link between organized crime and terrorist groups and between instability and conflict more generally. And so these are all obviously very high priorities for us within the European Union. But turning now specifically to ENACT. ENACT is dedicated to enhancing Africa's response to transnational organized crime. It was initiated in 2017 and is now in its second phase, implemented by ISS, GI-TOC and Interpol. We held yesterday the steering committee for ENACT, and we were very pleased to discuss the third phase of ENACT, which we're hoping to sign very shortly. And that is obviously a vote of confidence from the European Union that we're seeking to renew this project for an extra 2 years. ENACT provides an evidence base on transnational organized crime through research, and it supports Africa's key practitioner and policy stakeholders from the state, regional entities, academia, civil society, through capacity building and technical assistance. As indicated in the Global Organized Crime Index, developed by GI-TOC, one of the ENACT partners, and launched just 2 weeks ago, 83% of the global population now live in countries with high criminality. And it's worth noting that that figure is up from 79% in 2021. So it does seem that trends are on the rise. Another key finding from the index is that countries categorized as full democracies continue to exhibit higher levels of resilience to organized crime than authoritarian regimes. And that might not come as a surprise. Even though organized crime does touch all societies without exception, the good governance practices that are open, transparent, and embedded in the rule of law and encourage active engagement from citizens do mitigate the negative impacts of organized crime and lay the groundwork on which to build both state and non-state responses to criminal threats. Africa specifically has continued to experience high levels of criminality in the 2-year period since 2021, remaining the second highest scoring continent in the world. And we're expecting more detail on these trends when the dedicated third Organized Crime in Africa Index is launched in November this year. So all looking forward to that. And acknowledging this, the ENACT project notes that a core concern in understanding criminal markets in Africa is the role of empirical data that can inform policy and practical interventions, and notably the lack of that data very often, and the lack of understanding of many of these criminal markets, which is where ENACT plays such a valuable role. And so this obviously is the value of today's discussion. First, our panel of experts will open with a discussion on key developmental trends in Africa, and then they will consider how these trends are reflected in organized crime on the continent, followed by a more detailed discussion on specific illicit markets, in particular those related to illegal environmental trades and criminality and drug markets. And I would just note that we are talking later about illegal logging in Central and West Africa, illegal logging, I believe, is estimated at around $150 billion per year. And so another of our priorities within the European Union, as partners here are probably tired of me saying, is climate change. And so this is, I think, something that we need to address in that context of climate change, because this is obviously a very significant illicit trade. In any case, these discussions will highlight the increasing complexities of criminal markets, the convergence of transnational organized actors and networks in the region, and highlight even more the call for more bilateral and multilateral coordination from state actors and partners. I am sure that, like me, you will find the discussions informative and valuable to your work, and I wish you all the best for your discussions, and would like to end by reiterating that the European Union remains committed to supporting the important work of enhancing the response to transnational organized crime in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew, for your opening remarks. I think you have highlighted several of the important trends that will be discussed this morning, including in the panel discussion later on. But for now, let me turn to our first speaker, who is Ronak Gopaldas. Ronak is the director of Signal Risk. His work focuses on the intersection of politics, economics, and business in Africa. He has previously held several management board positions in a number of executive committees. He's a prominent voice on the continent when it comes to security and political dynamics. So, Ronak, could you please walk us through what you think are 5 major trends to consider in terms of emerging issues in Africa?
Thanks very much, Ornella, for the kind introduction. In the interest of time, I'm going to modify the talk slightly and, in fact, answer 3 questions. So we've really kind of seen a lot of change in the past few worlds in what's happened in the world. And what I'm going to try to answer is what's changed, how has it impacted Africa, and where do we go from here? So the last few years has felt a little bit like a Quentin Tarantino movie, full of shocks and surprises and twists and turns. And how do we make sense of it? We will now have heard of this word polycrisis being bandied around a lot, multiple crises occurring simultaneously where the risks are connected. And the 2 that obviously spring to mind are the pandemic and the Ukraine war. So if we kind of unpack the impact of the pandemic, I think we really need to appreciate its significance and its magnitude. We had not seen economic conditions like that since 1929, very depressionary conditions, a downturn in developed and developing markets simultaneously. We hadn't had a public emergency like that since the end of World War. At the same time, you had a contest and a clash between liberal and authoritarian values. You had the climate emergency starting to gain real traction. And in 2020 as well, you had the Black Lives Matter that was unleashed after the killing of George Floyd, which triggered a wave of social protests across the world. So multiple things coming together simultaneously at the same time. And it was a seismic moment, and it marked a shift in the world in general. The last time we saw something like that was in 1989, 1990, where you had Tiananmen Square, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the release of Nelson Mandela from prison. And so the zeitgeist had changed, right? And what happened in 1989, 1990 paved the way for the Washington Consensus and the era of global democracy, global capitalism, and global liberalism, and that rules-based order, which kind of persisted for the better part of 2 decades. It was punctured by the financial crisis in 2008. Then we got austerity, we got quantitative easing. But then in 2020, something shifted, and we've seen shifts towards a more authoritarian, nationalistic, and isolationist kind of mindset in many parts of the world. Now, what this means also is that these developments have fundamentally shifted the global economic and political architecture. And there's contestation around the visions and values for the future. At the same time, it's also kind of put the role of the state into the spotlight. You know, on the one hand, the state, through this public health crisis and emergency, has emerged as a key actor and an actor that citizens are dependent on. But at the same time, we've seen corruption, governance shortcomings all being exposed. So very paradoxical in nature. The broad theme here, though, is that social contracts are being questioned, both in the international order, with the likes of the UN Security Council and reform over there, push towards de-dollarization, the rise of the BRICS grouping and the expansion of that, the expansion of the G20, and then domestically as well, with culture wars, with cleavages in society, with coups that we're seeing resurface in many parts of the continent. The thing about social contracts is that they are either rejected, reformed, or rewritten. And so that's the broad global context in which we are operating. Now, in an African context, and you know, that's kind of the kind of broad event, the impact from COVID. And of course, we've seen with the war, the divisions between the global south and the global north being exacerbated. And I'll go into a little bit more detail around that as we proceed. So that's kind of broadly the event. The impact on Africa, significant, right? And African leaders are really angry at the moment because they're saying stuff that happens elsewhere in the rest of the world is impacting us disproportionately, but it's not our fault. So we had the global financial crisis caused by the US housing market. We got affected. COVID started in China. We got affected. Russia, Ukraine, impact on food and fuel prices. The climate emergency was created by the West, but now we have to be the sacrificial lambs. And if you look at the rhetoric by folks like William Ruto, the Kenyan president, he's saying, we're trying to do this ourselves, but the system is rigged against us. We're fighting it with one hand tied behind our back. And then if you look at the comments from Andrew Mitchell in the UK, who says also, you know, we can save a bank in California in 3 days, but Zambia has waited over 2 years for debt relief. Kind of puts things in perspective. And this is not to say to use this as an excuse to say that African leaders are absolved of governance failings and things like that. It's just to say that the global order has changed and we need a level playing field. And if we break this down into the economic and political impacts of this, I think we can see why this argument is being made, right? So economically, 2020 was the year of the 3 C's: COVID, capital flight, and commodity price crashes. 2021 was the year of the 3 Ds: debt, disease, and dysfunction. 2022 was meant to be the year of recovery. Instead, we got 3 Rs: Russia, risk, and recession. And, you know, obviously, given that changed global context, what did we see happening in our largest trading partners? We saw a strong dollar, which put pressure on the cost of funding for African states. We saw Europe grappling with an energy crisis, which again, through contagion, transmitted through to many African states and food and fuel pressures. And China, up until last year, maintained a zero COVID policy. So the impact kind of plays out in 3 channels economically. Number one, through financial markets. Strong dollar means that there's risk aversion, there's capital flight, there's contagion. Your cost of funding for African countries becomes exorbitant and you're locked out of international capital markets. And we saw both Zambia and Ghana defaulting, and the risk with 20 elections next year and current market conditions is that you could have a situation of bond walls and ballot trains. So the combination of bad politics and bad economics puts you under pressure. So, you know, that's and the cost of funding is significant because that means there's less money to spend on other areas, other developmental priorities. Then from a trade perspective as well, lower demand as a softer global economy plays out. And then we've already had supply chain issues emanating from the pandemic. And then, you know, a softer global economy means, and this current set of macro headwinds means that development partners and global powers are likely to be more insular in how they invest, right? So that's how it plays out economically, and lots of headwinds for the African continent. At the same time, politically as well, we've seen this division between the global north and the global south playing out. And And it's really been exposed around voting patterns around the UN, the Ukraine war at the UN Security Council, where we've seen different countries voting in different ways, some because of Cold War nostalgia and historical allegiances, some because of ideological symmetry and dependency, some acting neutral, and some as the democratizers voting against Russia. But what this has done has kind of indicated the splits between the global north and south, and the vision and value for the future is being contested now. And Africa is a theater for competition amongst both established and emerging powers. We've been here before during the Cold War, where effectively we were piggy in the middle. The idea now is that with the amount of interest and investment, that we become kingmaker rather than piggy in the middle. Almost done, Ornella. So that's the situation we find ourselves in, where there's a lot of interest. Africa has been courted as the belle of the ball, and we have to exercise strategic leverage and economic diplomacy, because given our population size, our demographics, our resources, we are going to be a meaningful player in the global economy going forward. By the year 2050, 1 in 4 people in the world are going to be from Africa. Okay, so that's kind of how it impacts us. Where to from here? The past few years have shown us that we should not rely on external partners. We should bet on ourselves. We have a very unique dilemma in Africa. We're being asked to democratize and industrialize simultaneously, to do so whilst going green in a context where there's premature deindustrialization and the robots are potentially coming for our jobs, right? So we can't adopt the developmental model that every other continent has. We have to hack the ladder. And to do that, we need to use smart cuts, and we need to exercise agency and to bet on ourselves. And my thinking is that the 3 hacks, the 3 smart cuts, so to speak, are the 3 I's. Integration, and we know all about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, where it's the low-hanging fruit. Intra-Africa trade is 15%. It creates kind of greater regional blocks. The Continental Free Trade Agreement, if it comes together, creates a market size bigger than India, which is too big to ignore. Then we need to industrialize, and to do that, you need infrastructure, hard, soft, and digital. And then the third thing is we need to innovate. So we know that innovation in Africa is largely driven by necessity. We've heard all about M-Pesa and the likes, and how we can achieve that leapfrogging element. But then the green economy, the blue economy, the purple economy, the white economy, and the gray economy are areas where which are completely underserviced, underdeveloped, and provide opportunities to really grow our economies and create jobs. So in conclusion, our risks, our rewards, our challenges, our opportunities. We need to exercise agency. Otherwise, this decoupling that we're seeing between the developed and the developing world is going to continue. And that's not something we can afford, given the extent of our challenges.
Thank you very much for this extensive screen setting. The situation is indeed extremely complex, and I will turn now to 2 colleagues to help us get an overview of the organized crime situation, more specifically between the broader framework of current trends in Africa and in the world that you just highlighted. So I will be turning to Professor Etanibi Alemika, who is a member of the ENACT Advisory Board and a longtime supporter of the Organized Crime Global Index, which is in its 3rd iteration this year by the Global Initiative. So, Professor, can you help us situate the current context of organized crime in Africa?
Thank you, Ornella. I'm going to make some observation just as an introduction to the presentation of the findings of the African Organized Index. And some of the points I want to offer as a background as follows. First is to emphasize that organized crime, either the domestic, that is national or transnational levels, are nothing new. They've been part of human history and civilization. And, if you look at human civilization, you've been seeing people preying on each other in groups, not necessarily as individual criminals. The second point, of course, is to note that the world has become increasingly interconnected, not just with respect to the recent globalization, but over centuries. We find increasing interconnectedness as transportation improves, communication improves, technology improves. We find this interconnectedness. This had facilitated legitimate business. But of course, for legitimate business, you have the observe. The obverse is obviously organized crime. So they go side by side. They have the same logic. The logic of organized crime is not different from the logic of legitimate business. So with the interconnectedness of countries, of nations, of continents, we also find interconnectedness in manifestation of organized crime. With particular reference to Africa, Africa also has been part of the growth in organized crime, increasingly integrated into the global transnational organized crime market, and both as perpetrators, as victims. A good example to illustrate this interconnectedness is a popular narrative in West Africa that cannabis were actually introduced into the region by soldiers that were conscripted by the colonizers to fight in the so-called First and Second World War in Asia. And that was the origin of cannabis. So you find these almost a century-long interconnectedness in cannabis problem that we're dealing with today, assuming that narrative is true. Another area that I think we need to also appreciate in going to the third African index is that there has been a growing involvement, and which has generated, in some cases, hysteria, or what sociologists call moral panic in Western world about influence of African organized crime in the West. But this also had started in the 1980s with a major economic crisis which ran across African continent. And of course, I'm sure had continuity today. It's almost been a permanent conflict, crisis, economic crisis. This has worsened the involvement of Africans in organized crime, as well as Africa being a center of organized crime for foreign actors. So we find that there is a relationship between economic crises, which tend to generate political crises, and organized crime, and vice versa. Organized crime tends to aggravate political and economic instability. That's one of the things we will find, a cycle that an understanding through index like this can help us to find a mechanism for breaking such a vicious cycle. Another point to highlight is that until recently, probably over the last decade, while there have been a lot of concerns in the early 1980s, those of you who remember, drug was the entry point, followed by human trafficking, followed by other, advanced fee fraud, or what we call some kind of cyber crimes. We note in this respect that not much is known. A lot of figures were bandied, a lot of explanation were bandied around in concerning Africa, but not much was known until the last decade, when we're beginning to find some systematic information that are both useful locally and then transnationally. And we begin to have development like the African Crime Index. This particular index is in its third series. The first one was produced in 2019, the second one in 2021, and the third one in 2023, which will be launched, but which will have a preview of the findings today, which will be presented. This index is an intellectual, policy, as well as practical tool. We must understand the three dimensions. It's a tool that is useful for intellectual enterprise of understanding the state, the extent, the pattern, the trend of organized crime in West Africa, the actors, participants, and sometimes the motive for the organized crime in West Africa. At the policy level, this information allows us to begin to intervene using this understanding as an effective or more efficient way of addressing the problem. And as a practical level for law enforcement agencies, it does provide us the beginning of strategies, whether at strategic, tactical, operational level, to address the influence of organized crime in Africa. So we have a tool that for now, to be modest, is probably unrivaled in terms of the understanding and information it generates about the dynamics of organized crime in Africa. It also provides information that relates to diversity as well as changing character of organized crime. As I said, the logic of organized crime is similar to the logic of legitimate business. And therefore, you find where there is greater profit, the business follow. So organized crime also follow where there is great profit and there is less restriction, less enforcement. So the same logic applies. This trend also allows us to find out the scale, allows us to understand this. And another area, as I conclude, is that also give us some idea about the capability of African governments to counter the influence of organized crime in their respective countries. And this is very important because what we found is that you find states with high criminality, which in the short run have high resilience. And I use the word short term because you cannot have high criminality and over a long period and still maintain a high resilience. So the countries with the high resilience must not sit back. They must understand that it's only useful for the short term. The long term implication is that we begin to erode their political system, their governance, their economy, and even social relations in those countries. So this is the context for the Africa organized crime, the detail of which, of course, will be provided by Rumbi Matamba. Thank you, Ornella.
Thank you, Prophet Anibi Alemika, for setting the stage. And as you indicated, we have online a colleague from the GI-TOC, Rumbi Matamba, who is an analyst. She works on the Observatory of Illicit Economies in Eastern Southern Africa, where she has published work on targeted killings in South Africa, among others. I will give the floor to Rumbi to walk us through the key findings of the Organized Crime Index for 2023. Rumbi, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ornella. Hoping that everybody can see my screen clearly. So I'm going to be looking at the Africa Organized Crime Index, drawing on findings from our 2023 Organized Crime Index. Just to set some context in addition to what Professor Alemika has just said, the index continues to be an expert-led tool. So for the development of the 2023 Organized Crime Index, we have consulted over 160 experts to provide expertise on criminality and resilience in Africa and across the globe as well. So in 2021, for the 2021 iteration of the index covered 10 criminal markets and 4 criminal actor types. But for 2023, we have expanded the criminality scope of the tool. So we now include an evaluation of an additional 5 markets, as well as 1 additional criminal actor type. And this enables a more comprehensive evaluation of the constantly evolving criminal landscape across the various jurisdictions. So as you'll see on the screen in front of you, we now have added extortion and protection racketeering, counterfeit goods, the illicit trade of excise goods, cyber crimes, and here we're looking specifically at cyber-dependent crimes as opposed to cyber-enabled crimes, and then financial crimes. And then in terms of the new actor category, we're looking at private sector actors. And this is looking specifically at how actors who control a segment of the legal economy separate to that of the states collaborate with other criminal actors. So just really quickly, the tool captures criminality by evaluating 2 components. And this is the scale of criminal markets as well as criminal actor types. And then in terms of resilience, we're looking at 12 what we call building blocks of resilience, which have the potential to provide holistic and sustainable responses to organized crime. All the indicators in the index are scored on a scale of 1 to 10 based on the scoring thresholds that you're seeing on the screen in front of you. But it is crucial to bear in mind that the thresholds are reversed for criminality and resilience. What I mean by this is a score of 1 in the context of a criminal market signifies the most desirable scenario. And this is where it indicates the absence of any illicit market. But for resilience, that is reversed in the sense that 1 is concerning because it represents the least desirable scenario, indicating the absence of the resilience measure in question. So now to go into the 2023 Global Organized Crime Index results, comparing Africa to the rest of the world. The key finding of the 2023 index is that criminality continued to grow globally, regardless of the continent, while the global average for resilience stayed the same as the last iteration, resulting in what we're seeing as a widening gap between criminality and resilience on the other. As you see on the slide in front of you, Africa saw the second highest levels of criminality globally after Asia. However, it was also the continent that experienced the smallest levels of increase in criminality, an increase of 0.08 points since 2021, when taking into account the additional new indicators that I mentioned before. That being said, when taking into account only the old criminal market indicators, the continent saw the second largest increase in criminality with a score change of 0.23 points. What this suggests is that the new criminal indicators are on average less prevalent than the original 10 criminal markets. And this holds true not only for Africa, but globally as well. In terms of resilience, continental rankings remained the same. So Africa remains the lowest scoring in resilience, although we see that it had a marginal increase, a marginal but noteworthy increase of 0.05 points between 2021 and 2023. And it is one of 3 continents that have improved in resilience, while the Americas and Asia registered declines in their scores. And so when averaging global resilience, we find that resilience worldwide has remained the same as in 2021, while again, criminality continues to increase. So we can continue to evaluate these results by looking at what we call the vulnerability matrix to explore the relationship between criminality and resilience in depth. So you see on the screen in front of you that the x-axis represents criminality and the y-axis represents resilience. There have been significant changes under the vulnerability classification with an overall 25 countries across the globe moving positions. More importantly, 12 countries shifted from low criminality into high criminality under the 2023 iteration of the index, and 5 of these 12 were from Africa. So in breaking down the quadrants in front of you, starting with the bottom left beige quadrant, where countries with low criminality and low resilience are placed, here you see that just as in 2021, the majority of countries, 71 of them, fall into this category. And half of the countries on the African continent fall under this classification of low criminality and low resilience. Right next to that in red, this is where countries in the most dire situation are placed. So compared to 2021, where 57 countries were in the high criminality and low resilience category, we see this year that this has increased to 63 countries. And of these 63, 21 are from Africa. When taking these 2 quadrants together, so the beige and the red quadrants together, we see that 48 out of the 54 countries in Africa live in conditions of low resilience to organized crime. Now moving to the top left green quadrant, and this is where countries ideally want to be placed in the low criminality but high resilience category. 47 countries fall within that quadrant, but only 3 are from Africa, and these are Cabo Verde, Mauritius, and Rwanda. Finally, that top right peach-colored quadrant, we see 12 countries, and this is high criminality, high resilience. And as Andrew mentioned, Taking this quadrant along with the bottom red, we see that 83% of the global population live in countries with high criminality, up from 79% in Nigeria in 2021. And so Nigeria, Senegal, and South Africa were among the 12 countries falling within this peach-colored quadrant. Now to move on to the more thematic results of the index. In terms of criminal markets in Africa, you can see that the most pervasive criminal market continues to be human trafficking. Human trafficking is ubiquitous, it being the second most pervasive criminal market globally. The prevalence of this criminal practice is correlated to various factors, including the numerous ongoing conflicts that Ronak has just mentioned, the economic push factors that leave people vulnerable to trafficking, and the involvement of state-embedded actors in facilitating these activities. As we found to be generally the case worldwide, financial crimes were also prevalent in Africa, with the market ranking the second most pervasive criminal market on the continent, with an average score of 5.95 points. Financial crimes were found to be at their highest by experts in North Africa. And the pervasiveness of this market stems from widespread incidents of financial fraud, tax evasion, embezzlement, and the misuse of public funds. The third most pervasive market in Africa was arms trafficking, which is also, again, a direct consequence of ongoing conflicts and the activities of non-state armed groups on the continent. So in countries such as the DRC, for example, the Central African Republic, Chad, Somalia, as well as Ethiopia. But on the other side of the spectrum are the heroin trade and extortion and protection racketeering, which were identified as criminal markets that have a much lower presence, not only on the continent, but globally too. And the least pervasive market on the continent was cyber-dependent crimes. As for the significant changes between 2021 and 2023, the cocaine trade, despite its low continental average score, saw the largest increase between 2021 and 2023. So this change shows that the continent has been affected by changes observed in the transnational cocaine trafficking patterns that have been observed in recent years. And I will touch a little more on this, as will my colleagues, as we go forward. And now to move over to the criminal actor types. As was the case in 2021, state-embedded actors were found to be the most dominant criminal actor type in the world. This is the same in Africa as well. So the influence of foreign actors, in addition to state-embedded actors, also grew the most compared to other criminal actors within the index since 2021. And this highlights the interconnectedness of transnational criminal networks, as Professor Alemika just mentioned. But there's also evidence of individuals engaged in the private sector. And remember, the private sector actor category is a recently introduced criminal actor category. And private actors who operate independently or collude with the state-embedded actors perpetuate criminality across the continent. And these activities include the facilitation of money laundering and illicit financial flows. However, as you can see from the slide, their influence is lower than that exerted by the other criminal actor typologies. And lastly, what we see is that mafia-style groups are the least influential criminal actor typology, not only on the continent, but globally too. And then in moving over to resilience, to the resilience findings, as mentioned, Africa continues to be the lowest scoring continent in terms of resilience, with a continental average of 3.85. Similar to global trends, the highest scoring indicators on the continent are international cooperation, so more traditional and law enforcement type of indicators, such as international cooperation, national policies and laws, as well as territorial integrity. Meanwhile, the more softer measures, such as victim and witness support, as well as prevention, are found on the other end of the spectrum. In fact, the continental average for victim and witness support is the lowest in the world in Africa for this indicator. And this is thought to be a consequence of the shrinking space for civil society on the continent, which generally spearheads victim prevention programs on the continent. And this is shown with a decline in the continental average for non-state actors, which is a marginal decline of 0.07 points. But it still indicates this negative trend that's observed globally of a declining space for civil society and non-state actors as sources of resilience against organized crime. But on a more positive note, African countries have demonstrated efforts towards prevention, and we have seen an increase since 2021. And this is an important step because it aims to build safeguards to protect against criminality by effectuating these behavioral changes in vulnerable groups and reducing the demand for illicit activities to take place. Now, I want to move over to some of the connections that we see between Africa and the global illicit economy in light of the 2023 results. So what you will see on the maps that I will share, on the two maps that I will share, is that Africa is firmly placed in the global illicit economy, and it plays an important role in all the stages of the illicit supply chains in different markets. So it plays a role as a source point in terms of environmental markets, for example, as well as transnational human smuggling. It acts as a transit point when looking at drug markets, as well as a destination point, again, when looking at drug markets. And I'll illustrate this using a few criminal markets that I evaluated under the index. So starting with the drugs trade. Following the arrows that you can see in front on the screen in front of you, Africa is a transit and destination area for drug markets. So you're looking at, from the arrows in front of you, cocaine coming from Latin America, mainly from Brazil, transiting through West Africa, East Africa, as well as Southern Africa, to supply not only African consumer market, but also en route to European consumer markets. And then in terms of heroin markets in West and East Africa, you see that Africa serves a role as a destination point, as well as a transit point onwards to European and US markets. And then we see that cannabis markets from North Africa, transit from North Africa to supply European markets. And then in terms of synthetic drugs, we see that they come in through North Africa from Europe to supply African markets, African consumer markets. And then moving over to human smuggling and human trafficking. While human smuggling and human trafficking are two...
Rumbi.
Yes, Ornella.
We would need to wrap up in the next 2 to 3 minutes.
Okay. So just in terms of human smuggling and human trafficking, while these are two distinct markets, they often correspond with one another. And what you're seeing on the screen in front of you is that they correspond in terms of the routes that are used. So looking at routes from the Sahel, from North Africa into Europe, they correspond in terms of the criminal actors involved. And then what may start off as human trafficking sometimes will change, what may start off as human smuggling, sometimes will evolve to human trafficking along the transit route. And then in terms of environmental crimes, levels of environmental crimes continue to increase in Africa, showing Africa's role as a supplier country. So in terms of non-renewable resources, for example, we see that they move from Central Africa, refined and then smuggled onwards to markets in the UAE, for example. And what we find within the index is that of the 3 environmental markets, non-renewable resource crimes increased the most. And of the top 5 countries in the world, 3 of these countries were from Africa, and these are Libya, the Central African Republic, as well as the DRC. And then just quickly to conclude, to discuss some of the key findings of the index. As mentioned, the gap between criminality and resilience continues to grow, and it grows at a staggering rate in response to intensifying political, social, economic, and security challenges, signifying the difficulties involved in addressing the phenomenon. Secondly, and this has been mentioned already, we find that democracies which boast more accountable and effective state institutions founded on the rule of law continue to exhibit higher levels of resilience to organized crime than authoritarian regimes. And then this highlights the relationship between regime type and resilience and serves to highlight the need for coordination among the pillars of democratic societies to better understand the threats faced and develop more effective responses. And lastly, and this has already been mentioned before, the analysis shows that the more affected by conflict a country is, the higher the likelihood of it experiencing reduced levels of resilience to organized crime. So I will stop here. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Rumbi, for this presentation of the main trends and key findings from the global index. So we now have a few minutes for discussion. Our speakers have laid the ground, and I would invite questions or comments from the room here or online. Perhaps to start, we have one question online. Someone is asking whether these new trends in Africa have any connection with Mexican cartels, and if we see the connection between illicit activities in Southern America being connected or about to be more connected to organized crime in Africa. Rumbi, would you like to take this question?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Ornella. And so and this is something that my colleague will touch on, just in terms of the connections between different locations, looking not only at Latin America, but also locations such as Mexico and Afghanistan as well. We do see that there are connections between the continent as well as these locations in terms of different criminal markets, as mentioned before. So not only the drug markets, but we find that just in terms of other criminal markets, we do see the connection between Africa and different locations. And I hope I'm capturing that question correctly.
Thank you, Rumbi. I see we have someone who raised their hands online. Bola Adetula.
Good morning. Thank you very much. Professor Abilemeka, it's nice seeing you again. My own question is this. I retired in 2005, and all I have been expecting to see a change in all this narrative is getting worse. Now, it's not enough for us to come here and discuss. I just want to find out, how do you ensure that the officers on ground in various countries in Africa actually have access to all these documents and thereby look for ways to counter and produce results? I haven't seen any change since 2005, honestly speaking. Rather, to me, it appears as if I might be wrong, because it is true I've retired, but I'm not tired and I still follow. So that is my own observation. Thank you very much.
Professor Alemeka.
Thank you, Madam. For those who do not know, she was the head of the drugs plan for AU for almost a decade. And so she's speaking from knowledge. I think you are right in terms of the overall attention of governments. But I think beyond government, thinking of civil society and even some of the government, there is an increasing understanding of the threat of organized crime to governance and for development. But this has not been even in Africa, especially at some level. For example, if you look at the indicator, there's a lot of problem with the level to judiciary and law enforcement, which is very useful. There's still not much that is being achieved with respect to non-law enforcement approach to solving some of these problems. So I think the crisis also inbuilt into the economic and political social problems that pervade Africa. And until we're also able to address those economic and social political problems, we may also have to, I won't say content, we will also continue to find these crises of not much progress in the area of criminality because it becomes an alternative enterprise when legitimate opportunities are not available. Thank you, Madam Bola.
Thank you. I see another hand raised, Luca Kuol, who is also a member of the ENACT Advisory Board. Luca?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I listened to this one in Nairobi, a great presentation, and I just appreciate the wealth of the work being put into this exercise. Maybe just two questions, although some of the questions we discussed in Nairobi as well. One is, out of 160 experts, are they all Africans, or how many Africans? Second, you mentioned very well that at least in terms of the resilience scores, that Africa is having the lowest, but exceptionally managed to show a slight improvement in the resilience score. Can you just unpack a bit, what are these components of the resilience that Africa managed to register improvement? Thanks.
So, Rumbi, I would like to add two more questions on the Organized Crime Index that came through the chat. So one is about gender dimensions. Does the global index highlight specifics on gender? And the second question is whether we see an increase with drug flows from Morocco to Europe.
Okay, thank you, Ornella. So starting with Dr. Luca Cole's questions about experts, out of the 160 years, majority are from Africa. And here we're looking at country experts who provide expertise on specific countries, but also looking at thematic experts who provide expertise on a particular thematic area. So on the different criminal markets that we have included in the index. And so for the Africa Index, yes, majority of them, of the 160 are from Africa. And then in terms of unpacking resilience and where we have seen some of these improvements between 2021 as well as 2023. So what we see in terms of resilience, we find that there are some notable improvements in terms of the indicators measuring anti-money laundering, the indicators measuring economic regulatory capacity, the indicators measuring victim and witness support, the indicators measuring preventative actions towards reducing organized crime, as well as international cooperation. So international cooperation is the indicator that has increased the most as countries in Africa showed preference towards more collaborative measures amongst themselves. So either bilaterally or within the different regional economic blocks that we have on the continent that have partnered in combating organized crime within the different regions, but also amongst different countries sharing different border points. And then the question on an increase in drug trafficking from Morocco. So the scores for Morocco in terms of the drug markets, which are high. And so looking at things such as cannabis, looking at criminal markets such as cannabis, which score a 9 out of 10, synthetic drugs, which score a 6 out of 10, as well as the heroin trade, which now shows a 4 out of 10. And this is an increase from 3 in 2021. So what the results are showing in majority of the global, in majority of the drug markets, there is, the results have largely stayed the same, but the heroin trade, we have seen a change in Morocco with an increase in heroin trafficking. Thank you, Ornella.
Thanks, Rumbi. I think we also had one question about gender. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, so if I'm understanding the question correctly, and this is a question on whether we, so a question asking me to comment on the gender dimensions. And I just want maybe some clarity on whether these are gender dimensions in terms of the development of the tool itself. And if that's in relation to the development of the tool, yes, the experts are, we do have a wide gender representation in terms of the experts consulted in the development of the index. But gender dimensions in terms of the evaluation of the criminal markets, criminal actors, or resilience indicators, while that is not something that is evaluated as a standalone indicator, we do take into consideration how different criminal markets or different criminal actor types intersect with different societal trends that we see on the continent. And that would include perhaps the influence of women actors, the influence of gender diverse actors as well. So gender is not looked at as a standalone indicator, but it would be considered in the harms of a criminal market, for example, as well as the criminal actor typologies that we evaluate within the index.
Thank you, Rumbi. I am turning back to Professor Alemika for a question we have in the chat. To what extent can we say that the corruption in institutions set up to combat crime is affecting the fight against organized crime, based on your decades of experience in criminology?
I think that's an obvious question, that corruption weakens institutions. And to that extent, I actually alluded to it, that we find challenge with judicial institutions, and also those are part of the elements of the measurement of resilience, that the index tried to highlight. So corruption is a major factor in weakening or eroding the capability of institutions to fight the organized crime. But more importantly, when you find a measure of state-embedded actors, that's again an area where corruption and organized crime are linked, where actors within the state accomplished through corruption in weakening the fight against organized crime.
Thank you very much. We have a follow-up question that goes in the same direction, asking why or how democratic regimes are more resilient to specific organized crime markets, such as drug trafficking. I wonder if you would like to share some ideas on this.
Yeah. Well, I've just mentioned about institutions. I think the strength of institution is actually this democratic system is the strength of the institutions to hold actors accountable. So one major thing you find in respect to enforcement basically is democratic institution. It is not necessarily that the crime level or rate may be lower than in non-democratic, but indeed there is a swiftness, fairness in the whole judicial process, which then create a number of incentives or disincentives to criminal behavior. So it is through strong institutions and the efficacy of those institutions and citizen trust in them in supporting their work that you find that democratic society tend to be more efficient in combating crime generally, and especially organized crime.
Thank you. I would like to turn to Ronak for one question. Someone is asking in the chat how the African Continental Free Trade Agreement can be used to reduce or to fight organized crime.
So I think integration obviously creates more dependency. And, you know, with that comes more collaboration. And I think in terms of capacity building, institution, sharing of information, all of these kind of things that come alongside regional integration only stands to the logic dictates that, you know, as these things begin to build incrementally, they span across various aspects of the economy, across security sectors, and across other political dimensions as well. So I think the infrastructure around trade, intelligence, service, and sharing capabilities and regional collaboration will facilitate kind of greater intelligence and therefore greater collaboration and, you know, more efficient use of resources as well. So I think, you know, we've got to temper our expectations around the Continental Free Trade Agreement. It will be incremental progress, but I think definitely you know, with shared resources, shared vision, and shared capabilities, it enables greater intelligence gathering and therefore more efficient mobilization of resources.
Thank you. We have a follow-up question, but I think you touched on it, which was about the correlation between taxation and organized crime. I don't know if you want to add something on this specifically.
I mean, I think, you know, with taxation, most African states currently, the economic structures are very much mono-economy, boom-bust kind of scenarios where the state is the dominant actor, right? So a big challenge for many African states is to grow and increase the tax take and the tax net, and enhance the role of the private sector as well. So I think with that, you know, comes more transparency, and with that, hopefully, it's a counterweight to some of the nefarious activities that we see around organized crime. So I think from a developmental perspective, it makes sense.
Thank you very much. We keep having questions coming in, but I think we are going to have to move to the next session. This first introductory session was a good opportunity to get an overview of the various trends that we're grappling with, and the type of questions we received from the audience, I think, highlights the importance of strong institutions and democratic institutions as a matter of resilience. So now turning to the second part of our event today, which will be a panel discussion, we will be looking at illicit drug flows and environmental crimes in Africa. So to those who raise questions about these in the chat, don't worry, we have entire presentations on this. I will first give the floor to two colleagues from Interpol. Annabella Corridoni is the analytical coordinator of the ENACT project at Interpol. She assists analytical units from Africa with analysis and recommendations, and she works as a strategic analyst at national and international on national and international matters relating to organized crime, security sector reform, and the rule of law. She will introduce a joint presentation in which she will be complemented by Captain Christian Ayenengoye, who is the head of the Criminal Intelligence Analysis Unit of Gabon. He has been leading the unit in the fight against transnational organized crime in various fields such as drug trafficking, maritime piracy, and environmental crime, and has 13 years of experience with the Gabon National Police Force. Over to you, Annabella, and then Christian.
Thank you, Ornella. I'm going to present the key findings and the public version of the report on the illicit trafficking of Iboga from Gabon. And then Christian will present more on the findings related to the modus operandi. Christian will present in French. So for those of you here, I invite you to then read the rebrief. There are things that you need clarification. There is simultaneous interpretation online for the audience that join online. So just a few words on the objective of this assessment. So it started with the analysis conducted by the unit in Gabon on illicit flows of Iboga from Gabon to the rest of the world. And so one of the pillars of ENACT and the role of Interpol within ENACT is to assist countries to open analytical units, and we provide them with mentoring support on analytical skills. So during one of the mentoring sessions, we discussed with Gabon the opportunity to take a look and assess the global scope of this trafficking. And this is why we have drafted this joint report together to provide an overview of the illicit flows, but also the modus operandi and the major destinations. And as I said, there are two versions of this report, a police version that has been shared with the authorities in Gabon, but also a public version. So there is a copy here in the room, but also the link will be shared for those online soon. So just a few words on Iboga, because the first comment that I heard is from many people when we talk about this assessment is that it's not widely known as a plant and the trafficking itself. So this plant, and then Christian will elaborate more on the local dynamics around the trafficking of this plant. But Iboga grows, as you can see on the map, in Central Africa, in wild forest, but it's more prolific in Gabon. And there is a special link with the country because the plant is used for traditional rites, particularly by the Wigwiti community, as Christian also will explain. And it has reportedly sacred properties when it comes from Gabon. And this is a very important aspect when we want to understand the actors involved and why there is a specific demand of Iboga from this country and not from others. So in the roots of Iboga, we can find alkaloids that are psychoactive, the majority of which are called ibogaine. And this is what has been on the market often. It's the request for ibogaine precisely. So the consumption of ibogaine has stimulating properties and can cause hallucination. And scientific research, preliminary scientific research have shown that at toxic doses, it can produce respiratory arrest. So there is also some health risk related to this, but it has not been yet completely explored. So the alkaloid that is concentrated in the plant, we find it mostly in mature plants. And for Iboga to be considered mature, it takes between 3 to 5 years to grow. This is another key aspect because we will see that it has the trafficking, it has also an environmental impact. Because to be harvested, there are two ways. It can be either be uprooted, and so totally uprooted, or it can be the root bark from living plants can be harvested, and so this allows to regenerate the plant to regenerate, but it's very time consuming. So it's not what we have seen. What we see more is the uprooted plant, and of course having a huge impact not only on the environment but also in the local communities that rely on this plant. So here in the screen you can see, and then in the report you have a detailed explanation of each type or the form of ibogaine and Iboga that is consumed and sold mostly online. So the increased interest on Iboga, it's recent. It started to grow the interest in the last 10 years, especially for the treatment of substance use disorder. But there is no, as I said at the beginning, there is no enough yet scientific research to understand the real properties and the use, and there have been debates to do so. But in the meanwhile, the selling of the plant has increased, and we are going to show you in a while some graphics that explain and illustrate this increase. So in 2021, ibogaine has been identified as a new psychoactive substance of natural origin by scientific scholars. And this new part, it's considered new because it became recently available worldwide in online markets, but it's not a new alkaloid in itself. And as you can see, it can be consumed in different formats. So the number one is pure ibogaine, and it's usually it's the most expensive one as well. And this has been transformed and synthesized from the root bark. And then we have the second one, which is total alkaloid. And here we have different alkaloids, not only ibogaine, and it's usually around 70% of ibogaine, meaning that it's also in a high demand. It contains, is considered to contain a high level of ibogaine among with others. Then also we have seen online markets selling iboga's bark. So this is more used more like in a rudimentary way. It's more in a traditional way. And as I say, because the alkaloids are in the root bark, it's very much requested. And then other formats include capsules of iboga powder, as you can see in number 4. And then iboga seeds, as you see in the last picture. So this is to illustrate that the plant is being sold in different formats, but most of the time what we have seen while collecting information is that it's not wide known, and so we estimate that it's being underreported by law enforcement authorities. The plant is mostly used by individuals that offer detoxification therapies in private spaces and therapeutic clinics, both licensed and unregulated. In addition, a proliferation of online markets selling iboga has facilitated the access to the plant in regions where it cannot grow, increasing its global demand. And now, in a minute, Christian will explain about how this global demand has put pressure on the plant in Gabon. And my last point here is that the regulation on iboga is variable. It changes from country to country. Some countries strictly ban its use, and others allow it under strict medical control, and others have not yet regulated its consumption or medical use. But what is important, and what now I'm going to give the floor to Christian, is that to know that its exportation has been banned in Gabon. So the commercialization of iboga coming from Gabon is actually now it's illicit. So Christian, vous avez la parole.
Merci, Madame Annabella. Donc, il faut savoir qu'au Gabon, l'exploitation, la récolte et la transformation d'iboga est interdite sans autorisation préalable de l'administration des eaux et forêts, à l'exception des communautés villageoises qui jouissent de leurs droits d'usage coutumier. Il faut savoir aussi que dans les parcs nationaux et les aires protégées, sa récolte est formellement interdite. Étant considéré comme un bien culturel dans le cadre des rites traditionnels tels que le rite d'initiation au Bwiti, cette substance est aussi protégée par une loi portant protection des biens culturels. Donc, bien entendu, l'ensemble de ces différents textes qui ont été mis en place respectent les accords internationaux qui ont été ratifiés par le Gabon. D'ailleurs, dans le rapport, vous trouverez un tableau qui résume l'ensemble de ces accords. Enfin, suite à l'observation qui a été faite par le gouvernement concernant le développement d'un commerce illicite d'iboga à l'international, qui se matérialise par l'apparition de nombreux sites de vente en ligne ainsi que par d'importantes saisies d'iboga, l'exportation de cette plante a été suspendue à titre conservatoire en 2019, ce qui en rend toute exportation illicite. En effet, cette demande en iboga et ibogaïne, qui est toujours croissante, se matérialise au Gabon par une déforestation systématique des plants d'iboga qui sont présents principalement dans les parcs nationaux, ce qui affecte les populations locales qui l'utilisent dans le cadre Vous m'entendez?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Madame Annabella, vous pouvez passer au slide suivant. Donc, les informations sur les flux illicites d'Iboga sont rares, principalement en raison de la méconnaissance des propriétés de la plante par les services répressifs dans les régions autres que l'Afrique. Donc, cette situation, combinée à l'absence d'une réglementation harmonisée sur le commerce d'Iboga, contribue à ce que les flux illicites ne soient pas détectés et donc pas signalés. Par le passé, il y a des individus qui ont été arrêtés au Gabon pour contrebande d'Iboga du Gabon vers le Cameroun. Et il est fort probable que le Cameroun soit un pays de transit pour l'Iboga, avec l'Europe et l'Amérique du Nord comme destination finale. L'analyse des sources d'information indique également qu'au Gabon, l'Iboga est très probablement exploité par plusieurs réseaux criminels, tels que des réseaux criminels liés au braconnage d'ivoire et d'espèces protégées. D'ailleurs, par le passé, des trafiquants d'écailles de pangolin entre le Gabon et le Cameroun ont été arrêtés avec de l'Iboga qu'ils comptaient exporter et revendre. Donc, ces réseaux sont constitués de divers acteurs qui ont des rôles spécifiques. Ça va de la récolte de la plante, qui est majoritairement effectuée par les populations locales qui connaissent les endroits dans les parcs nationaux où trouver de l'Iboga, à la facilitation de son extraction illicite dans les parcs nationaux par certaines personnes qui disposent d'autorités au niveau local, à la vente et à la distribution du produit qui se fait principalement en ligne par des revendeurs. Il faut aussi savoir que certains acteurs, tels que les laboratoires et les membres de la sous-culture médicale que constituent les cliniques et les facilitateurs de thérapie par l'Iboga, opèrent dans des environnements où leurs activités sont légales, mais pas complètement réglementées. Ils s'approvisionnent en Iboga sur un marché illicite, parfois sans même savoir qu'il s'agit d'une composante illicite du commerce. Les informations sur les laboratoires qui synthétisent l'Iboga sont rares, ce qui a représenté une limitation pour l'analyse de cette section qui portait sur l'organisation de ces réseaux criminels. Donc, sur le slide, vous voyez un diagramme qui résume les principaux acteurs qui sont impliqués ou liés dans l'exploitation illégale de l'Iboga. Il faut savoir aussi que dans certains cas, le rôle des acteurs peut se chevaucher. Donc, par exemple, les grossistes peuvent devenir des revendeurs en ligne. Madame Arabella, vous pouvez passer au slide suivant. Donc, ainsi qu'on voit dans le premier diagramme sur le slide, on a constaté que le nombre de revendeurs en ligne a augmenté régulièrement au cours des dernières années. Donc, même si certains profils de vente en ligne plus anciens ont été supprimés, les informations montrent qu'en 2023, le nombre de revendeurs a presque quadruplé par rapport à 2021. Donc, cette augmentation peut s'analyser comme une augmentation de l'intérêt pour la consommation d'Iboga et très probablement la prise de conscience de ces criminels des bénéfices potentiels, ce qui, au niveau local, conduit inévitablement à une augmentation des exportations illégales. En outre, l'activité criminelle en ligne n'a cessé d'augmenter depuis 2020, ce qui s'explique par l'accroissement de l'activité en ligne qui a débuté lors de la pandémie du COVID-19. Donc, cela a eu probablement un fort impact sur le nombre de sites en ligne qui vendent de l'Iboga. Sur le diagramme suivant, qui est toujours sur ce slide, on constate que la majorité des revendeurs en ligne sont basés dans les pays d'Europe et d'Amérique du Nord, avec une part non négligeable de vendeurs qui sont situés au Cameroun. Donc, cette observation confirme bien la tendance qui a été décrite auparavant, qui fait du Cameroun un pays de transit et de l'Europe et de l'Amérique du Nord des pays de destination finale. Et donc, les grossistes qui résident au Cameroun deviennent à l'occasion des revendeurs en ligne. Sur la photo, on voit une des méthodes qui sont utilisées pour exporter l'Iboga, à savoir l'utilisation des sociétés d'envoi de colis. Donc, sur ce cas précis, il s'agit d'un revendeur en ligne qui est basé au Cameroun et qui déclare utiliser EMS pour l'envoi des colis d'Iboga. Madame Abel, vous pouvez passer au slide suivant. Donc, ici, il s'agit d'un cas pratique de trafic illicite d'Iboga du Gabon vers le Cameroun. Au centre se trouve un individu qui est basé au Cameroun et qui serait un important fournisseur d'Iboga en provenance du Gabon. D'ailleurs, dans les échanges avec lui via les réseaux sociaux, il a déclaré être en mesure de faire passer la marchandise en contrebande à travers la frontière entre le Gabon et le Cameroun avec l'aide de complices. L'affaire montre aussi que ces individus se font passer pour des initiateurs au buti afin de jouir de leurs droits coutumiers pour récolter l'Iboga et le faire passer clandestinement à la frontière entre le Gabon et le Cameroun avec l'aide de facilitateurs. Je vous remercie pour votre attention. Madame Annabella, c'est à vous.
Thank you very much. And I would just wrap up because we're getting out of time. So in the report, you will see that there is a section talking about the prices of Iboga and its fluctuation, and it's very much related with the destination and type and format of Iboga. But just to conclude, we expect with this report to also raise awareness on these illicit flows and to give more understanding to law enforcement agencies that also Iboga that originates from Gabon represents, as we call, quality sale. So it's very much requested from this country, but also that there is a cyber enabled component of this trafficking that deserves to be explored. And also that this lack of awareness and harmonization is enabling this illicit flow. Thank you very much.
Thank you both for the presentation. There is a lot to say about this very interesting report. However, I will encourage the next speakers to try and stick to the available time as we have limited time to wrap up the event. So next I am turning to two colleagues from the Global Initiative who will be presenting about the new insights from cocaine trafficking through West Africa. These are Lucia Bird, who is the director of the West Africa Observatory. She previously served as legal and policy advisor in Pakistan, as well as with the Ministry of Finance in Ghana. And Kingsley Madueke, who is the Nigeria research coordinator with Lucia's team. So please.
Thank you very much, Ornella. I'm afraid that my colleague Kingsley is unable to connect, so I will be presenting, but this is very much shared findings. I'll be sketching out what's happening with cocaine flows through West Africa, picking out some of the key routes and actors, and then considering implications both for West Africa and Europe. We know that cocaine trafficking through West Africa has been a challenge for a long time. So why is now a key moment to be considering transcontinental trafficking? Well, as we can see on the slide, we are in a moment of flux in the market and the surrounding infrastructure. We've really seen a spike in cocaine seizures in West Africa since 2019, as you can see, both in terms of overall volume and in the size of individual seizures. And we reached an unprecedented volume of seizures in 2022 at around 24 tons. Now, seizures tell us more about interventions and protection structures than they do about trafficking volumes, but we really have a range of retail and supply side indicators that point to this significant increase in volumes of cocaine transiting West Africa. These include, but are not limited to, record-breaking cocaine production in Latin America, reports anecdotally from across coastal countries in West Africa pointing to an increase, and also a commensurate set of reports around growing use of crack and cocaine across many countries in this region. I'll quickly map out some key routes before looking a little bit more about what the spike in the seizures tell us. The vast majority of cocaine enters West Africa, and a significant proportion leaves West Africa towards Europe by sea. And a key thing to emphasize is the growing importance of Brazil as an export point. Really, a very significant majority is exported from Brazil, with Brazil becoming, it would seem, the biggest export point to West Africa, both by sea and by air, since at least 2016. And once the cocaine reaches West Africa, consignments then travel towards Europe predominantly either by land northwards. They're cut up into smaller packages and they move on by air, or by far the biggest volumes, they are set out again by sea. And we have emerging evidence about a new dynamic. Data from MAOC, the Maritime Analysis and Operations Center, indicates that European criminal organizations appear to have, since 2020, started to exchange hashish produced in Morocco directly for cocaine produced by Brazilian networks, with some of the same vessels transporting cocaine in one direction and hashish in the other. Many vessels travel via West Africa, dropping off cargo for a later pickup, contributing to what law enforcement sources have described as giant stockpiles of hashish across the West African coast. Now, this trading exploits huge differentials in prices across the continents. So in Morocco, hashish currently wholesales for around $800 per kilogram, with cocaine being significantly more, around $28,000. While in Brazil, hashish and cocaine wholesale are much more similar, between $8,000 and $10,000 per kilogram. So the ability to exchange hashish for cocaine enormously increases the potential purchasing power of Europe and Africa-based groups, which could potentially result in yet more volumes moving across here, and no kind of financial trade required. West Africa really appears to have become an important transit hub for Moroccan hashish, particularly since 2020. So using MAOC seizure data from 2007 to 2019, 95% of the 457 tons of hashish seized by MAOC was seized in or around the Mediterranean. When we move to 2020 to 2021, in this period, the numbers flip. So 65% of hashish seizures by MAOC occurred in West Africa, around the Canaries or near Brazil, on this more southward trajectory. As discussed, the vast majority enters through maritime entry points. And here on the slide, we have some data from a mapping that we did of 280 illicit hubs across West Africa, where we then analyzed the intersection between illicit economies and instability in each hub. And here on the slide, we pick out the ports across the region identified as illicit economy hubs, with cocaine identified as one of the top illicit economies in each. But it's important to underscore it's not just ports. A very significant and likely growing proportion is transshipped offshore and leverages porous coastal areas to disembark, or simply carries on by sea. Turning to actors, again emphasizing the importance of Brazil as an export point, the Primeiro Comando da Capital, Brazil's largest organized crime organization, is really key in understanding these flows. The PCC was founded in 1993 in the prisons, and it quickly expanded its influence across the favelas of Sao Paulo. In the 1990s, the Brazilian state's response to rampant gun violence was mass incarceration, including for low-level drug offences, which channeled more and more poor young men from the favelas into the arms of the PCC. The PCC was able to establish a really strong governance of retail coca-based markets. And we saw then homicides fall by 70% in Sao Paulo between 2001 and 2010. Theories abound, but the most evidenced point to the role of the PCC in regulating violence, and we can really see its growing power. As you can see on the slide, there are a number of different stages in its expansion. So in 2011, we saw expansion throughout Brazil's 27 states. And then there were two key milestones in the PCC's pivot towards export of cocaine. Firstly, gaining significant influence over Santos port in 2014, and secondly, gaining control of the Paraguay corridor, which is a primary corridor for cocaine from Bolivia, Peru, and Colombia, and that was in 2016. And it's since 2016 in particular that we've tracked Brazil becoming a key export point for both Europe and West Africa. We haven't tracked the PCC's physical establishment in West Africa as of yet, but groups that are very closely affiliated to the PCC and central to the supply to Europe are certainly operating across West Africa. And it's key to underscore that the PCC's modus operandi is through alliances with a wide range of networks. And the PCC may well have played a role in enhancing the efficiency of this business. Engagement with business associates of the PCC supports the hypothesis that the group overall works to enhance supply chain efficiency, often decreasing profit per consignment in favor of pushing up overall volumes and driving up profits in this way. So turning to some of these other key alliances that are supporting the flow through West Africa in particular. Firstly, the 'Ndrangheta, the Italian mafia. The 'Ndrangheta has been operating in Brazil since the 1970s. However, the alliance between various 'Ndrangheta clans and the PCC appears to have strengthened since the mid-2010s. And the 'Ndrangheta appear to have been implicated in cocaine trafficking in countries across West Africa. Our existing evidence points to Côte d'Ivoire as an 'Ndrangheta stronghold, both as a transit point for cocaine, but we also see that it's operating as a money laundering hub and a key point for the establishment of various Ndrangheta clan brokers. And we see, for example, involvement in the construction sector, which is a preferred Ndrangheta strategy. Nigerian trafficking networks also very closely allied to the PCC. They have a very strong presence in Sao Paulo, and they're key, particularly in trafficking by air between Brazil, West Africa, and Europe. Nigerian nationals were the most common foreign nationality of mule arrested in Brazil with cocaine. And Nigerian nationals are the most prominent foreign criminal actor identified by the Global Organised Crime Index across West African countries. And we really see Nigerian networks operating across the cocaine value chain in West Africa. So import and export, predominantly but not exclusively by air, wholesale distribution, and owning fumoirs and other drug use spaces across the region. Balkan networks, which type of Balkan networks depends a little bit on the country. For example, we have picked up more of Montenegrin network presence in Cabo Verde, and there are indications that Albanian networks have sought to set up a node in the Gambia. It's unsurprising to see kind of growing indications of Balkan network involvement in the cocaine supply chain in West Africa, given the approach to vertical supply chain integration that these networks have exhibited, and the heavy presence of some Balkan networks in Latin America, particularly Albanian networks in Ecuador. Turning to regional players, we have regional entrepreneurs, which provide a pivotal interlinkage between foreign criminal actors and the state. For example, alleged, previously convicted and then acquitted trafficker Seriba, as well as Banda Keita in Guinea-Bissau and the Gambia, being typical examples, often dual West African European nationals. And these figures are often overlooked in our analysis, and yet they're really key nodes in connecting foreign criminal actors into protection structures, and they can be important nodes to consider in seeking to disrupt some of these interlinkages. And then finally, of course, state-embedded actors. As has been pointed out, state-embedded actors are among the highest criminal actors across the Organised Crime Index, and certainly the highest in West Africa, and absolutely pivotal to the cocaine trade. And we see that the protection of the cocaine trade is one of the reasons that the cocaine trade is so closely tied to governance in the region. Turning briefly to implications. Firstly, within West Africa itself, turning particularly to what cocaine seizures and the spike may tell us about regional stability, and why it's an important moment to consider this, given the apparent expansion in volumes that are moving through the region, as I've just outlined. It seems that periods of political fracture, conflict, political transition seem to be aligned with greater volumes of cocaine seizures in West Africa. And analytically, this makes sense based on the understanding that in many countries of the region, cocaine trafficking depends on political protection, which allows the trafficking machine to operate without disruption. And of course, seizures being an indicator of disruption. And if we look back across West Africa in time, seizures tend to cluster in periods where the political system is damaged, creating space for law enforcement action as some agencies can operate with more independence. And here on the slide, you can see the dynamics of two countries that in the region that illustrate this recently. We have seizure data for Guinea in green. And you see there's an enormous spike, essentially from 2022, in a trend that's continued actually into this year. And that happened months after the September 2021 coup, which disrupted existing power structures. We believe that cocaine trafficking through Guinea is in a period of expansion, but that the political protection around it is a little bit more fractured than previously. In contrast, in Guinea-Bissau, you can see the spike in 2019. This was just before elections. It was unclear who was going to win the elections, who was holding power. Law enforcement were operating with a little bit more independence. And so you saw this spike in bulk seizures, which has then disappeared. Despite ongoing intelligence of multiple transshipments offshore in Guinea-Bissau, we've seen far, far lower seizure volumes since, as the protection system has snapped back into place. And
Lucia, 1 minute to wrap up, please.
Looking also into consumption trends within the region, we are seeing consumption of both crack and powder reportedly increasing across a number of countries, particularly across the coast, although comprehensive data is lacking. On an international basis, we're also seeing retail market impacts in the EU. The EMCDDA tracked a 38% increase in the affordability of cocaine in Europe between 2015 and 2020, in a trend that appears to have continued. Of course, this is fed by routes beyond West Africa, but West Africa is definitely part of the picture. And of course, significant financial flows to organized crime actors across the supply chain. Finally, touching very briefly on entry points, it's key to recognize the priority of the West African route. This is not a minor route feeding Europe, but also looking at the regional impacts of this dynamic. Secondly, seaports as priority areas for monitoring and engagement. As discussed, although a lot of cocaine is coming in through other coastal entry points, ports remain really important pinch points in the supply chain and a good place to focus efforts. And finally, West Africa is currently in a context of quite significant drug policy reform, including a number of countries having introduced or considering the introduction of alternatives to custodial sentences. Now, if we're going to learn from the example of the PCC in Brazil, stopping mass incarceration of low-level drug offences, including for consumption, will help in disrupting the recruitment of individuals into organized crime groups. So although we typically see alternatives to custodial sentences from a harms perspective, which is key, we should also consider the potential impacts on disrupting recruitment. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this presentation. You raised a number of thought-provoking issues, and we will turn now to Serge Epoué for more on the cocaine flows in Western and Northern Africa. So Serge Epoué is a criminal intelligence analyst at Interpol, which he joined in 2009. More recently, in May of this year, he joined the ENACT project specifically, and he previously worked on similar issues with other organizations, such as the Council of Europe. Over to you, Serge.
Thank you, Ornella. So I think the previous speaker provided you already with a lot of information, and since I'm covering the same topic, I'll try to avoid repetition and try to bring maybe Interpol data into the perspective. So, well, just a bit of perspective, like indeed we have an increase in the production of cocaine globally. This is based on the fact that we have more cultivated area in Colombia, in Peru and Bolivia, which are the three main countries where coca bush is produced. So that leads to an increase in in cocaine production, and the number of seizures that we will see a little bit later. We have an increase in the number of seizures, which corresponds to actually an increase in the cocaine production globally. So now the production is estimated about 2,000 tons, 2,300 tons by various sources. So we have more cocaine being produced, and we have a global consumption of cocaine, which is on the rise as well. We can see that it has, according to UNODC figures, it's increased by 20% between 2015 and 2020, more or less. The share of consumption is relatively stable between different regions, but globally we have an increase in consumption. So on the one hand, we have more cocaine being produced. On the other hand, we have a larger consumer base. Why is the European market so important, and why therefore Africa is on the way? Well, because it's the most profitable market. The wholesale price of cocaine in Western Europe is about $48,000. And when you factor in the number of consumers in Europe and the average wholesale price, well, you get the most profitable market. And this is why we see Africa being on the way of these cocaine flows going to Europe. And European market also holds some other advantages. I mentioned the number of consumers, but high prices, multiple actors. The difference with, for example, the US, where we have Mexican cartels really controlling everything. In Europe, you have much more actors, which makes which gives more possibility for different trafficking actors to get into the play, and good logistics in seaports, in airports, in roads, make it easy to move cocaine on the continent. And overall, you have a favorable risk reward ratio for people engaged in cocaine trafficking. The penalty of, if you get caught in Mexico, is more, you'll be having more harder time than if you get caught in Europe or in the US. So favorable risk reward ratio for actors engaged in cocaine trafficking in Europe. So Africa is on the way. It's only, let's say, 2007 kilometers from Brazil, the Gulf of Guinea and in particular. So Africa holds some advantages for traffickers: geographic proximity, multiple entry points, a lot of isolated islands on the coast of West Africa, limited capacity of states to police the maritime domain for lack of resources of navies and police, political and security instability, poverty, corruption, free ports, free economical zones, which enables with limited control. And this is always a good point for traffickers to take advantage of. And increasing commodities flows. Africa is more and more integrated into with the world economics, where we see more passengers flying through African airports. We see more commodities going through African ports, and this enables to conceal actually illegal merchandise. So this is also why we have Africa, West Africa, North Africa being preferred routes for trafficking towards Europe, which is the end market. And we have extensive diasporas as well. We have a lot of Africans being located in European countries, but not only. We also see them in America, in North America. So that also helps to create networks, and then to have multiple persons who can be involved in networks. So if we look a bit at the dynamics between, well, yes, we see an increase from 2015. We don't have necessarily the same overall seizure amounts because we are used more police data that doesn't necessarily include customs data. So we have a difference in the overall numbers, but we see that the same patterns And we see an increase of seizures from 2015 with, let's say, a record of seizures in 2021. We also can see that North Africa had an increase in seizures till 2018. And then from this point, we have a flip where we have Western Africa taking over. 2019 is a major seizure in Cabo Verde, which actually makes the overall number of seizures in Western Africa go gets to a very, very high number. But then we see that, except for 2020, for obvious reasons, where we had all the COVID measures which prevented the circulation of people, but also commodities, then we go up again. And there we see really Western Africa dominating in terms of a number of seizures. So going back a bit to North Africa, in North Africa, Morocco is the country which is recording the most of the seizures. So it might also be due to the quality of Moroccan law enforcement into fighting against cocaine trafficking, but also their experience with hashish trafficking and so on. So which indicates that there are more seizures in Morocco. Doesn't mean that necessarily Morocco is the only country where we have cocaine flowing through, but Morocco also has the best infrastructures, the best, bigger ports, which is a big advantage for traffickers. And what is interesting to see is as well that we have seizures carried out in Northern African countries, but also in the figure 7 below, you see the seizures operated outside Africa, but with destination, with product destined to Africa. And here we see that we have a bit more of diversity, where in 2021 we had Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Algeria also being targeted by the criminal networks. So this cocaine didn't get to North Africa, but was seized before it reached North Africa, and mostly in Americas. So if we go to Western Africa, well, indeed, we see that it's consistent with the major trends. And what is particularly interesting, I would say, is that since 2021, we see that there are more entry points. In 2019, we had Cabo Verde, which represented 75% of all the seizures in Western Africa. But then 2021, we see that we have more in Guinea, we have more in Ivory Coast. So we have 3, 4, 5 countries which are recording huge seizures, which means that the disease is spreading, I would say, in many countries in the region. And we have a confirmation of that in 2022, where we see that we have major seizures in many countries. So while before we had major seizures in one place, Cabo Verde, and then we didn't see anything, now we see consistently high volumes of seizures in much more countries. And if we look again at figure 9, we can see that also in 2021, we recorded more seizures destined to Western Africa from other Interpol member countries. This did not reach Western Africa, but was about to be sent to Western Africa. So an example of maritime routes, I know it's a bit difficult to follow, but it's just to show you the diversity of the routings. This is based on Interpol seizures data and well, seizures that are communicated to Interpol. And of course, consistently with what the previous speaker said, well, we see Brazil holding the main position. We have some other South American countries not identified properly. I mean, sometimes we don't know exactly from which countries was coming from, but Brazil clearly dominates, a bit of Ecuador, a bit of Colombia. And then we see that this cocaine can be shipped through Morocco and end up in Libya or Nigeria. So we see different routings. Traffickers are looking for the least resistant path, so the best routes that they can exploit without being caught. So there are multiple possibilities and they are multiplying the routes. If we look at air routes, this is a bit even more complicated to follow, but this also indicates that they are really not considering the shortest path, but multiplying stop points in order to get to the final destination. And here again, we see that we have Brazil playing a major role, and as well as Colombia, Morocco also, because Morocco is reporting maybe more than other countries. They have a good reporting practice, but also because they have a very good air infrastructure in the region. So this is, we have a consistency. We see also Ethiopia, with Addis Ababa being one of the major transport hub in Eastern Africa. So this indicates that we see for air routes, these are mules, people who are ingesting drugs or maybe hiding drugs on them. And we have multiple possibilities to reach the final destination.
1 minute to wrap up, please.
So a bit about the notification. So this is an Interpol notices and diffusions, and what we see is that West African and North African citizens are more reported by European countries. So this is where we see these networks of Nigerian networks or the West African networks or Moroccan people being citizens being engaged in trafficking, but not that much in Americas, mostly Brazil. But when it's reporting from Brazil, we see that indeed it more relates to Nigerian criminals. So again, Nigeria playing a major role. And which nationalities the African countries, Northern African and Western African countries are reporting? We see North Macedonia, Serbia, which is the indicator of the presence of Balkan criminal networks. We see Italy, this is Ndrangheta at play. We see Brazil, this is PCC at play. We see Portugal, Colombia, but also France, and also some local nationals, African nationals. So indeed, yes, this we see some consistency. Brazil playing a main role, Nigeria playing an important role, Ivory Coast, which are appearing in the picture, and we see all the major criminal networks that have been mentioned by the previous speaker in Interpol notifications and diffusions, which means that these are people these people are recorded in Interpol information system. So quickly as a conclusions, I would say, well, we have a favorable context for trafficking, more cocaine being produced. We have an increased number of countries which are affected by these major shipments. We have shifting dynamics more in Western Africa now than in Northern Africa. We have increased number of major seizures, which means that the criminals, the networks have already secured somehow the routes, which means they are confident to send more. Long-lasting networks are still at play. This is not something new, but they are still existing and getting speed. We see presence of Brazil, Colombia, Italy, Spain, and others, as I mentioned. Local networks are also involved along the coast. And the instability in Sahel, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, will only make things worse, I believe. It's interesting though that in 2023 seizures figures, we see a decrease in the numbers. So that opens interesting questions. Are they rerouting after some major seizures in 2021 and 2022? Are they changing modus operandi? So this needs to be determined, but it's too early yet to have a complete picture of the seizures for 2023. But it would be interesting to see if we get a confirmation of a change or if we see the same trend continuing. Thank you.
Thank you. So without delay, we will move on to the next speaker, who will be talking about the illegal logging in Central and West Africa. Here he's been able to connect. So Oluwole Ojewale is the ENACT program regional organized crime observatory coordinator for Central Africa. He's based in Dakar, and he will be telling us more about illegal logging in Central and West Africa. Over to you. We cannot hear you, Wole.
Sorry, can you see my screen, Ornella?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you so much for the introduction. So basically, I want to talk on illegal logging, and I will be talking from the perspective of a few studies that the ENACT has carried out in the recent time in the Central Africa, and then try to also talk about the linkages to West Africa, particularly around Cameroon, Nigeria border axis. So I want to quickly underscore the fact that when we talk about Central Africa here, I'm largely focusing on the Congo Basin, which is made up of about 6 countries. And then to highlight the significance of the Congo Basin to illegal logging and the global call for halting deforestation as a result of the activities of various criminal groups that are now involved in this. So most people are already aware that the Congo Basin is the world's 2nd largest tropical rainforest and its biggest carbon sink. And there are scientific inquiry and assessment that actually show that more than a quarter of its forest could vanish by 2050 if deforestation that is mostly caused by illegal logging continues unchecked. And the Congo Basin should be at the heart of global climate action, particularly with respect to the climate change conversation that is going on now, if we are going to reduce carbon emission to the Paris Agreement of 1.50 degrees Celsius. And then it absorbs about 4% of the world's CO2 emissions, and its peatland alone store about 30 billion metric tons of carbon. But the forests are increasingly at risk, and as deforestation increased by 5% in 2021 across the 6 countries. And I think my point of departure is to first assert that the dynamics of illegal logging by criminal groups in Central Africa have changed in the last decade for various reasons. And this is the heart of my presentation, actually. One is the rise of terrorism, the protracted conflict in the Congo region, whether it is Cameroon, Central African Republic, and the DRC that is at the center of this, and then the evolution of terror financing. These 3 go together in the sense that the armed groups are now getting involved in sourcing for finance through illegal logging in the region, and it's creating a complex profile in tackling the illegal logging crisis in the region. And there is also the increased demand for forest products in advanced countries of the global north and south, European countries in this regard, and China particularly as major destination. And there's grossly inadequate resource for forest surveillance. This is a major challenge in the region in the sense that the government across board most likely lack the capacity to protect forestry governance in terms of security in particular. And these places have become safe haven for most of the armed groups that are actually engaging in illegal logging. There's also the role of corruption in these through fraudulent concession. There's a data about 87% of concession granted in the DRC are actually doing illegal logging. These actors are doing illegal logging outside the concession that is granted onto them. And you know, the DRC actually occupies about more than 50% of the Congo Basin as a whole. And then there's the role of the local support in terms of the support that they provide to the middlemen. And these are areas that are riddled with endemic poverty, and they see the timber, the trees, as a gift of nature that they can take for their own livelihood, engagement, and economic support. So most of the times, the people that come from cities actually leverage the relationship that they've built with these people over time, who actually lead them into the forest. And the role of border porosity, most of the timbers that are logged in the region go in the direction of East Africa. They are taken out maybe through Uganda and then Rwanda, are mostly taken out through the Western axis, particularly Nigeria in this regard, with respect to the boundary that the country shares with Cameroon. Though most of them come from southwestern part of Cameroon, they go through the Central Nigeria, Kogi State, Taraba State, and then they are ferried to Onne Port in Port Harcourt or to Lagos Port, where they are actually taken to their destinations in Vietnam, in China, and other destinations in Asia. And the big one is the ENACT certification mechanisms. Most of the times, the organizations getting involved in these are based in Brussels, in London, and they rely on local support of actors that are actually supposed to engage in the certification process to ensure that the logs that are coming out of these places are actually certified by government. But what we've seen is that the conflict profile and the corrupt tendencies of the embedded state actors are actually frustrating this effort, and a lot of logs are actually taken out of the region. The actors and their modus operandi, these include local community, like I said, the dwellers in the villages. They are mostly indigenous people, and the major source of economic livelihood to some of them is actually these timbers in form of trees that have lasted for many years. And the exploitation is going on a daily basis because of the endemic poverty that I highlighted earlier. And then the middlemen that are coming mostly from cities into these villages, they buy at a very cheaper rate and then they sell at the exorbitant price. But to the local people, it is huge money that they think they are making from that. And then there is also the foreign buyers who are mostly Asians, who are actually based in the cities and rely on the middlemen to bring those trees for them in the cities before they ferry them out of the region, whether through Douala port, through Lagos port, through Onne port, or any other port, maybe Matadi port. And then the role of the foreign mercenary has also come to the fore in the recent time, particularly with respect to what Wagner Group is doing in the Central African Republic, engaging in illegal logging and timber trafficking, while they claim to be supporting the regime to help create a secure environment for the government. And the multiplicity of armed groups in this regard, whether it is in Congo, the M23, whether it is in Central African Republic, the Seleka rebels, and the terrorist groups that are, and the separatist movement that are also operating around Cameroon, Central African Republic. These are a litany of actors that are involved in illegal logging in the Central Africa now. And then the harms, the deforestation of the Congo Basin has potentially catastrophic consequences, and this can be linked to the impact on the climate change. Really, it increases climate emission and is predicted to reduce rainfall in Ethiopia and across Sahel, damaging agriculture and exacerbating climate migration. This is the ripple effect based on scientific evidence in terms of how this is going to generate multiplier effect if illegal logging is not altered, particularly in the next 2 to 3 decades. And then the deforestation also has a huge consequence on the livelihood of the people, about 75 million people whose livelihood rely on the forest acts. And then the wildlife habitat are equally vulnerable. There are 39 mammal species and a third of the plant species in the Congo Basin that are not found anywhere. Now, I propose, based on the work that we've done in terms of what should be the solution. One is that I need to put forward here that conservation of forestry resources has emerged as a security issue. We can't run away from that, looking at the activities of poachers in the recent time. And now a lot of wildlife protectors, the guardians, the people, the security guards within the area are actually having to cope and contend with the forces of terrorism, the forces of armed groups in the region, who are also searching for sources of terror financing, and most of the time they turn these timbers to coal, which they actually trade in the underground economy. So the state need to come together to form a multinational joint task force, and then to be able to put up a strong front in combating illegal logging through security means. That is the number one thing. And the national forest ministries can also integrate public whistleblower policy with projects that involve civil society in forest governance, because they are the people at the base, and the supply chain of illegal logging actually start at that level. And we have seen experience like in Cameroon, where community volunteers are trained to use satellite link phones to document illegal logging and make toll-free calls to report suspicious activity to the police, Forest Ministry, and National Anti-Corruption Commission. These are some of the examples that can actually be replicated. And then the Republic of Congo also passed a law in 2020 to combat forest exploitation and illegal logging. And what they did basically was to enshrine local communities and indigenous people in the involvement in the forest governance and establish a community forestry scheme. So these are pockets of experiences that can be replicated at a larger scale in the region in combating illegal logging. And then there's the regional initiatives that are put in place. In the recent time, there was a meeting where the Saudi Arabia and Emmanuel Macron of France actually made certain pledges in Gabon to support to support any activity that is going to halt deforestation in the region. So there's a need to target initiative that can address some of the global players that are highlighted in Europe, in Asia, and North America, not just coming to donate money. It's also important that they are seen to be complying with the rules and standards that are put in place in places where they are actually protecting their own tree, when they are making incursion into the forest in Africa. And then the trade regulatory agencies in the global North and Asia need to also implement transparent measures that ensure responsible sourcing of timber from the Congo Basin. And then a robust timber certification process, like I mentioned earlier, for the entire supply chain is essential, so that the people that are sending the data from the local community are actually doing the work, and then they are receiving the necessary support in terms of infrastructure that can enable them to be able to do their work. So in this regard, there's a need for international governance in terms of forestry protection and checking or halting illegal logging. And then the government should also create a tropical timber groups with representatives that include importers, retailers, and environmental advocacy group to monitor the certification process. The last thing that I want to say in this regard is that in terms of climate finance for halting or addressing illegal logging, even though the Congo Basin plays a significant role in terms of scientific evidence with respect to how it can help in combating climate change, we've not seen significant investment in this direction. Attention of global actors, overseas development, finance, and support has been focused on the Amazon in Brazil, and at the same time, the forest in Indonesia, in Southeast Asia. So there's a need to also escalate this to the global conversation and having, drawing the attention of the global actors to also provide sufficient financing in terms of protecting the timbers, the trees in the Congo Basin, so that the support that is also given to other regions can also be met with the Congo Basin as well. And some of the things that I've quickly discussed within the few minutes that I have are actually products and ideas and content that ENACT has created over time as far as Congo Basin and forest protection is concerned. So these are some of the sources we've worked on, how conflict in car. Yes, Ornella, I'm thinking probably I still have maybe 1 minute.
No, actually, you're 3 minutes over time.
Oh, okay. So this is just my last slide, and then some of the work that we've done that you can see on our website. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Willie, for this presentation. I will turn now to our last speaker. We spent a lot of time focused on Central and Western Africa. Now we're turning to Malawi. Inspector of Police Andrew Kachere is the head of the crime analysis unit in the country. He has 20 years of experience with the Malawi Police Service, including 14 with the criminal intelligence field specifically, and he will be telling us more about the criminal intelligence analysis and environmental crimes in Malawi within 10 short minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me again. In the next 10 minutes, I'll share with you on intelligence analysis and environmental crimes in Malawi. So let me agree with the previous speakers that the threat of organized crime in Africa is substantial, and the crime syndicates remain highly concentrated across the borders. And this is why these transnational organized crime groups make use of sophisticated and complex networks. So they are flexible and can easily adapt to restrictions and regulations of enforcement and measures that reduce opportunity to maximize profits. You know, the objective of organized crime is to generate financial and material benefits. So as such, you find that this development at both local and the national or transnational level underscores the importance of criminal analysis. So the generation of criminal analysis is critical in enhancing law enforcement capacity to fight against all sorts of organized criminal acts, and that threatens peace and security. In this regard, Interpol, through ENACT project, enhanced this fight against organized crime by establishing analytic unit, and Malawi is one of the beneficiaries of that. So we have sought to bring criminal intelligence analysis techniques to bear on investigations and enable more effective understanding of transnational organized crime in Malawi and beyond. And in this regard, we've again focused on environmental crimes. So since its establishment in 2018, the unit has produced a number of environmental crime analytical reports. And these reports are mainly focused on identifying the potential criminal syndicates within the wildlife and the environmental criminal network.
Richard, can we get the English version, please?
So again, we're looking at nationalities that have been involved in these criminal syndicates and the endangered species involved, hotspots, and probably informing the ongoing investigation. So in general, the analytical reports sought to provide integrated criminal analysis in supporting operational and strategic approach to environmental crimes and wildlife crime management. So after that, ENACT and the Malawi Police Service, with combined efforts to understand the threat caused by transnational organized crime in Malawi, including environmental crimes, we did some criminal intelligence analysis. And through this crime analysis coupled with investigations, we're able to identify some of the key issues which are in this regard exposed criminal syndicates, which involved foreign nationals, especially from China, Zambia, and Mozambique. And the key actors in all these syndicates were the Chinese nationals. But at the same time, again, the involvement of women in environmental crimes also was reviewed, especially in illegal possession and trafficking. But at the same time also, we identified that some of the wild species, especially seized in Malawi, cross the borders from our neighboring countries. Since Malawi has been used as a transit country in terms of wildlife products and some environmental issues. So these criminal groups do not restrict themselves to trading solely in ivory or pangolins, lion horns or lion teeth, but other species also. And they exploit their established trade routes through conveying illegally sourced forest produce, such as timber. We have this local tree called mukula. This has also been a part of this syndicate. So some of the orchid and the other plants also have been exploited by these criminal groups. So as part of the comprehensive efforts, we have tried as Malawi to make sure that all these networks that have been identified should be dealt with. And with this, the country had to redouble its efforts in ensuring that we improve its wildlife legislation and environmental crimes. Therefore, the enforcement in Malawi has significantly improved in recent years, and some of the trends have evolved. This is as a result of proactive policing strategies and the amendment of National Parks and Wildlife Act, which has helped a lot in the enforcement of the laws. For instance, some of the convictions within the old act had a maximum of 10 years custodial sentence, but with this amended one, we have 30 years of custodial sentence as the maximum. So in concluding, let me say that data and evidence on criminal groups' modus operandi, commission-led analysis are the foundation of evidence-based policy making and program development. As such, developing effective strategies for tackling environmental crimes depends upon a sound knowledge of the crime and those committing it through criminal intelligence analysis. So we may say that criminal intelligence analysis provides a better understanding of organized crime dynamics, and that it can be used as a tool for law enforcement agencies. And it is good that we increase international liaison on jurisdictional investigations and best practice sharing, and also participate in multilateral intelligence sharing initiatives that will help to combat environmental crimes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Inspector, for this interesting presentation. I think you provided us a useful overview of how the criminal intelligence analysis system and units work in Malawi as a potential example for other countries as well. We will now turn to the discussion, and I invite everyone to be ready with their questions. We are quite behind time, so I will ask for your indulgence as we might go slightly over time at the end. But right now, first of all, our colleagues who are handling the technical part will be starting the evaluation for this event. So our participants online will have a short questionnaire showing up. Here it is. Please take a few moments to answer the evaluation. So we have had a run-up of 5 presentations on various issues covering drug markets, especially Iboga and cocaine on the one hand, and environmental crime, which again regards Iboga, but as well illegal logging and environmental crimes in Malawi. I think some of the participants already had raised their hands for questions. I would invite them to re-raise their hands so I can see it. Or if we have questions in the room here in Lyon as well. No, so we have one question for the last speaker. Okay, we have one online too. But so first of all, one question from for the last speaker, coming from Catherine Marquette, who asks, can you please comment on the analysis findings on women in Malawi?
Yeah, thank you very much. Especially if you look at the role that women play in transnational organized crime, we found that even in this illicit market of wildlife crimes, women are so involved. Now that is through illegal possession and the trafficking. So these women are playing different roles, and they're taking part at different levels. So the analysis also reviewed the role of women within the wildlife crimes. If I don't know if I captured your question correct.
I think so. Thank you very much. I will turn now to Bola Adetula. You have the floor for your question, please.
Thank you very much again. I just want to re-emphasize how all these findings and everything will get to the policy makers as well as the officials that will implement all these policies, because all we have been discussing, I really enjoy everything, honestly speaking, very enlightening and informative. But my worry, especially if you fly from Lagos to Banjul in Gambia, you will see a lot of uninhabited, isolated, small islands. Those are the places the light aircrafts from Brazil land. And then they will make sure they cause confusion before they get all their wares through the various countries. So Interpol, I'm just appealing to you. on ground, the officials on ground in various African countries help us to emphasize a strong inter-agency cooperation, because most of these countries, the drug people are not various bodies take control of all this security. For example, Nigeria, you have a body for drug, another Interpol does something else, and the police does something else, everything. So there must be a strong inter-agency cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this important comment that reminds us the need for policy uptake of research findings. I think our colleagues are working on this, and maybe one of them will comment on this later. But for now, let me turn to Feyi Ogunade.
Yes, and good afternoon, or good morning from Abuja, Nigeria. I have actually enjoyed the presentation. But just following from what the last, can you hear me properly, please?
Yes, we can. Please go on.
Okay, good. Yeah, just following from what the last speaker has said, particularly in terms of interagency collaboration and cooperation. I'm the Regional Organized Crime Coordinator for Observatory in West Africa, working for the ISS for ENACT. And my interest is in West Africa. And so whatever concerns West Africa, I should know, and I'm interested. And I've been following the presentations quite closely. But following from what the last speaker has said, what I've observed, particularly with ECOWAS, we've been doing a lot of good work, Interpol, ECOWAS, GI-TOC, even ENACT, we've been doing a lot of good work. But as I keep reminding my colleagues, I think there's a slight missing link. And I know the African Union, I know some of these bodies collaborate a lot with the African Union, I understand that. But in terms of real concrete collaboration, I think that is absent. For example, I was talking to my colleagues yesterday when we had our weekly meeting. There is a center in Mali there's a COC center in Mali, the Mali Center, which was formed by the African Union sometime last year. I think it was launched in 2021, but it started functioning in 2023. Well, particularly for migration, but other TOCs as well. And of course, there's also the Khartoum Center in Sudan. Okay, I understand it's not functioning properly. But I spoke to the director sometime last week, and they are very, very interested in collaborating with ENACT, ECOWAS, and other organizations. The point I'm making is, in terms of collaboration and interfacing all these other groups, I think the African Union has a particular leverage, particularly, I'm now concluding a study I did, particularly the African Commission. There are a lot of studies which the African Commission has done on TOCs, even though its mandate does not particularly include TOCs, but they've done a lot of work around that. And I suspect if we collaborate particularly with the African Union, and particularly with the African Commission, they have the leverage to talk to member states and make sure that some of these things are ameliorated or combated. As a matter of fact, if you are not happy with what is happening within your region,
hello?
You can actually...
Hello?
Hello?
Yes, please, 30 seconds to go straight to the point.
Okay, yeah. No, the point I'm making is that we have the African Union, particularly with the African Commission, has a lot of leeway in talking to member states, and so that we can ameliorate some of the excesses of TOCs. And I don't see that much within the continent, and particularly within West Africa. It's not a question, it's just a commentary.
Thank you very much. So your recommendation to increase the engagement with the African Union Commission is well noted. I wonder if we have more questions. There is one observation here online about the Africa Organized Crime Index. Someone is saying that it does not reflect the Southern Africa reality sufficiently. I wonder if this might be because today's presentation was specifically focused on West Africa. Okay, I have ENACT officials in front of me nodding, so this might be the reason, and I would invite the person who made this comment to actually look at the index itself and have a broader overview of different regions and sub-regions. Yes, so over to you, Annabella, you have a comment?
Just a second. Yeah, just to comment on the comment on the comment of Bola Adetula on sharing information and cooperation between well, from Interpol perspective between law enforcement agencies, which is of course the part of the mandate of Interpol, but also at the core of our role within ENACT. And this is why we also support analytical units in all African regions, because the aim is to build a network of analysts working on transnational organized crime from the region. And then through the partnership that we have within ENACT with GI and ISS to then inform policymakers on the criminal trends. So this is, it's a very important comment and remark that we are really working on it, and it's at the core of our objectives and project.
Thank you. Actually, I would like to follow up on the same line of thought with Lucia. Lucia, could you tell us how you think policy uptake of such critical research can be improved?
Thank you, Ornella. I think it's of course a key point. We don't want research for research's sake. We need this to inform policy making. We at the GI engage consistently with policymakers, both within the region and externally. And I know our colleagues at ISS and Interpol do also. I think coalitions, partnerships, like we can see here between Interpol, ISS and the GI are key, so that we can really cumulatively maximize the entry points on which we are engaging in terms of responses. So engaging with policymakers, law enforcement, but also really importantly, engaging with civil society and with journalists, so that this information, this data is being fed through a number of different information channels and can really shape the response holistically and not just through one specific channel. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for these various points. Okay, well, as we don't seem to have any burning questions waiting at the moment, and we are about the end of our allocated time, I would like to thank everyone for your attendance and participation, for your engagement in the conversation. Today's session was an opportunity to browse over the many complex and important trends in terms of organized crime activity in Africa. We do have, with the ENACT program, a unique tool to continue working on these issues, and we invite you to keep an eye on the various publications that will keep informing this conversation. Of course, we would like to thank the Interpol for hosting this event in their premises here in Lyon today, and the other partners and members of the ENACT consortium, as well as the European Union as its main funder. So on this, I will now wish everyone a very happy afternoon and close the meeting. Bye-bye.